What medieval marriage was really like, it's worse than you think. Picture this: a 12-year-old girl, trembling in a cathedral, about to marry a man she's never met who's older than her father. The assembled nobles smile approvingly as gold changes hands, sealing not a union of love, but a transaction that will determine the fate of kingdoms. Welcome to medieval marriage, where romance went to die and political calculation ruled supreme. If you think modern dating is brutal, wait until you hear what our ancestors endured in the name of matrimony. The sanitized fairy tales of medieval romance bear no resemblance to the harsh reality of marriage between the 5th and 15th centuries. What you're about to discover will shatter every romantic notion you've ever had about the good old days. Medieval marriage wasn't about finding your soulmate. It was about survival, politics, and cold, hard economics. For the nobility, marriages were diplomatic treaties written in flesh and blood. For peasants, they were business mergers where the bride often came with a dowry of livestock, land, or labor contracts. The age of consent? Laughably irrelevant. Canon law set the minimum age at 12 for girls and 14 for boys, but these were often ignored when political necessity demanded it. Historical records reveal marriages of children as young as 7, though consummation was typically delayed until puberty. A small mercy in an otherwise merciless system. Consider the case of Isabella of Valois, married to King Richard II of England at age 6 in 1396. She spent her childhood in a foreign court, a living symbol of political alliance before being widowed at 11 and married off again as a teenager. Her story, while extreme, wasn't unusual among the nobility. For common folk, the stakes were equally high but differently calculated. A farmer's daughter might be married to secure access to water rights, to unite 2 plots of land, or to forge an alliance between families in an uncertain world where survival often depended on community cooperation. Here's where things get truly disturbing. The medieval wedding night wasn't a private affair between 2 lovers. It was a public spectacle that would horrify modern sensibilities. The practice of bedding ceremonies meant that wedding guests would literally escort the couple to their bed, often undressing them and witnessing the consummation to ensure the marriage was legally binding. Imagine the terror of a young bride, possibly meeting her husband for the first time that day, being stripped naked in front of cheering strangers and expected to perform her wifely duties as entertainment for drunken wedding guests. These ceremonies weren't rare exceptions. They were standard practice among the nobility and wealthy merchants. The church attempted to regulate these practices, but their alternatives were hardly better. Medieval marriage manuals written by celibate monks provided bizarre and often dangerous advice about sexual relations. These texts treated women's bodies as mysterious and potentially dangerous territories that needed to be conquered through prayer and determination. Medical knowledge was so primitive that many believed women could only conceive if they experienced pleasure during intercourse, leading to the disturbing medieval practice of ensuring female compliance through various means. The ignorance surrounding female anatomy was so profound that many marriages went unconsummated for years simply because no one understood how reproduction actually worked. The concept of romantic love within marriage was not just absent, it was actively discouraged as dangerous and destabilizing. Medieval theologians and philosophers argued that excessive affection between spouses was a form of adultery, a corruption of marriage's sacred purpose, producing legitimate heirs and maintaining social order. The troubadour tradition of courtly love that modern audiences find so appealing was specifically designed around loving someone you couldn't marry. The whole point of courtly love was its impossibility. Knights pined for married noblewomen precisely because the forbidden nature of the relationship kept it pure and spiritual rather than carnal and corrupting. When married couples did develop genuine affection, they were advised by the church to moderate their feelings. The 13th century theologian Thomas Aquinas wrote that a man who loved his wife too passionately was committing a sin equivalent to adultery. Love, in the medieval mindset, was a distraction from marriage's true purposes: economic alliance, political stability, and reproduction. This created a bizarre situation where emotional intimacy was often found outside marriage. Medieval literature is filled with passionate friendships between same-sex companions, intense spiritual relationships between religious mentors and disciples, and elaborate courtly love affairs that remained unconsummated precisely because they were more emotionally satisfying than the cold business relationships that constituted most marriages. But wait, it gets worse. The daily reality of medieval marriage was a grinding horror of isolation, violence, and desperation that makes modern relationship problems seem trivial by comparison. Medieval law gave husbands virtually unlimited power over their wives. The legal doctrine of coverture meant that a married woman ceased to exist as an independent legal entity. She became her husband's property as completely as his horse or his plow. He could beat her with impunity as long as the stick was no thicker than his thumb. Yes, that's where the phrase "rule of thumb" comes from. Women couldn't own property, make contracts, or even write wills without their husband's permission. If a woman inherited land, her husband gained complete control over it upon marriage. Divorce was virtually impossible. The church recognized only annulment, and then only under very specific circumstances that usually required political connections and substantial bribes. The isolation was perhaps worse than the legal oppression. Medieval women, particularly nobles, were often married off to distant lands where they knew no one and spoke different languages. They were cut off from their families, their friends, and everything familiar, trapped in foreign courts with husbands who were essentially strangers. Letters from medieval wives reveal heartbreaking loneliness and desperation. Marguerite de Navarre wrote to her brother about her marriage. "I am as one dead, buried alive in this place where no one speaks my language or understands my heart." Such testimonies appear throughout medieval correspondence, painting a picture of widespread emotional devastation. The ultimate purpose of medieval marriage, producing heirs, was itself a death sentence for countless women. Maternal mortality rates were staggering. Historical demographers estimate that between 10 to 20% of women died in childbirth, with rates even higher among the nobility who were expected to produce multiple children regardless of their health. Medieval medicine's understanding of pregnancy and childbirth was not just primitive, it was actively harmful. Physicians believed that women needed to be kept weak during pregnancy to prevent the baby from growing too large. Pregnant women were bled regularly, fed restricted diets, and forbidden from exercise, creating conditions that virtually guaranteed complications. The superstitions surrounding childbirth were equally dangerous. Midwives performed bizarre rituals, used herbal concoctions that were often toxic, and followed practices based on astrology rather than anatomy. If a woman survived the birth, she faced the constant terror of future pregnancies. Contraception was forbidden by the church, and the cycle of dangerous births continued until death or menopause provided relief. For those women who did survive multiple births, the psychological toll was devastating. Medieval sources document what we would now recognize as severe postpartum depression, but which was then attributed to demonic possession or moral failing. These women received no support, no understanding, and no relief from their suffering. Even for peasant families, marriage was an economic calculation fraught with danger. A medieval bride's value was literally calculated in terms of her dowry, her capacity for labor, and her potential for producing working children. Marriage contracts read like livestock deals, with detailed inventories of what each party brought to the union. The dowry system created a vicious cycle of poverty and desperation. Families bankrupted themselves providing dowries for daughters, then demanded dowries from their sons' brides to recoup their losses. Women without adequate dowries faced lives as unwanted spinsters, servants, or, in the worst cases, prostitutes. The economic pressure was so intense that families regularly sold daughters into what amounted to sexual slavery disguised as marriage. Wealthy merchants and nobles would marry multiple young women from poor families, providing minimal dowries in exchange for what were essentially concubines with legal status. These arrangements were particularly common during times of economic hardship, when desperate families had no choice but to accept any offer that provided security for their daughters. The resulting marriages were characterized by extreme age differences, economic exploitation, and systematic abuse that continued until the women died or their husbands tired of them and sought annulments. Occasionally, medieval sources reveal marriages that seem to transcend these harsh realities. The letters between Peter Abelard and Heloise show genuine intellectual and emotional connection, though their relationship ended in castration, forced separation, and lifelong regret. The marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine to Henry II produced both passionate love and spectacular political drama, but also demonstrated how even the most powerful women remained subject to male authority. These exceptional cases highlight just how unusual genuine affection in marriage actually was. When medieval chroniclers encountered couples who seemed genuinely fond of each other, they wrote about it as something remarkable and noteworthy, clear evidence that such relationships were far from the norm. Even these rare love matches were constrained by the social expectations and legal limitations of their time. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe, was still imprisoned by her own son when her political activities threatened his authority. Love, however genuine, provided no protection against the fundamental inequalities built into medieval marriage. The legacy of medieval marriage practices extended far beyond the Middle Ages, shaping Western attitudes toward marriage, sexuality, and gender roles for centuries to come. Many of the assumptions about marriage that we're still fighting to overcome, that wives should be subservient to husbands, that marriage is primarily an economic arrangement, that women's primary value lies in their reproductive capacity, have their roots in medieval practices. Understanding the true nature of medieval marriage isn't just an academic exercise in historical curiosity. It reveals how recent our modern concepts of companionate marriage, romantic love, and gender equality really are. The idea that marriage should be based on mutual affection and respect, that spouses should be equal partners, that love should be the foundation of family life. These are revolutionary concepts that would have horrified our medieval ancestors. The next time someone waxes nostalgic about traditional marriage or the good old days, remember the 12-year-old bride trembling in that cathedral, the wedding night spectacles, the women dying in childbirth, and the economic calculations that reduced human beings to property values. Medieval marriage wasn't a romantic ideal. It was a survival mechanism in a brutal world, and its true legacy is a reminder of how far we've come and how much further we still have to go. The fairy tales lied. Medieval marriage was worse than your darkest imaginings, and the real miracle isn't that some couples found love despite the system. It's that humanity survived such a dehumanizing institution long enough to evolve beyond it.